Well, we saw some amazing scenes in Sydney yesterday with hundreds of people wearing the Star of David, waving Israeli and Australian flags, calling for an end to the anti-Semitism that swept across this country since October 7 last year. A very different type of protest compared to the pro-Palestinian marches we've been forced to endure week in and week out. No one waving terrorist flags or spitting abuse. There were, however, plenty of signs saying, "Elbow, the world is watching." One of the speakers at yesterday's rally was former Labor MP Michael Danby, and he joins me now. Michael, tell us about yesterday. Particularly, I'm interested in the feedback that you were getting from Jewish Australians who attended that march.
Well, it was in Martin Place. There's about 3,500 people. The reaction was very strong, and they weren't just Jewish Australians. There were a lot of Christian people there, and a lot of people from Iran and from the Indian community. And basically, they're tired of the government allowing our streets to be dominated by what they regard as extremist Islamist elements. But the line that I said about the government ministers spending their time in synagogues and at Holocaust centres, that they would be better out in Lakemba telling some of those extremist preachers who were saying that Jews should be killed, that that's not the Australian way of talking, and we expect them to behave themselves. And if they don't have Australian citizenship, they should be out. The line that got particularly the biggest interest, because there are a lot of Israelis there who some of whom are Australian citizens, was about Tony Burke. And I explained that Tony Burke has instituted its discriminatory tourist plan where only young Israelis from the only democracy, no other democracies have it happen to them, whether it's Greece or the United States or the UK, where they are given a 13-page questionnaire interrogation by Tony Burke about their army service, who their relatives are, who else of their relatives served in the army. Very detailed 13-page interrogation. And people thought that was really unfair, that people from Russia or China, which are totalitarian states or authoritarian states, don't face similar interrogations by Tony Burke when they come to this country. And they think it's very unfair that Israelis, all of whom who have to do national service, and he knows that very well, are subject to this very detailed and very strange and, I would argue, suspicious interrogation. What are they accumulating all these details for, James? Who are they going to share them with? And what kind of action is being taken against innocent young people who come to this country as tourists?
Yeah, well, of course, these are young people from a country that I thought was one of our allies. And we're asking their young people, have you been involved in war crimes or genocide? I mean, it's just unbelievable. There was a fair bit of anger, obviously, at the Prime Minister at the rally yesterday. And I guess when you've got government ministers constantly sprouting anti-Israel messages like this.
We expect Russia to abide by international law and end its illegal and full-scale war on Ukraine. We expect China to abide by international legal decisions in the South China Sea. We expect Israel to abide by international law.
So be it anti-Semitism or Islamophobia.
The government's been criticised for always saying anti-Semitism alongside Islamophobia. James Macpherson says that's part of the problem, that you should just call out anti-Semitism for what it is, because it's worse now than anything else.
Sorry, so should we turn a blind eye to Islamophobia? Is that what the coalition's saying?
If James Macpherson thinks there's no Islamophobia in Australia, he's wrong.
He didn't say that, though. He said that when something happens, it should be enough to just denounce anti-Semitism.
He went on to say that they're not at the same levels.
I guess, Michael Danby, you can understand why so many Jewish Australians are pretty upset right now.
Well, again, James, I just want to emphasise that it was more than just Jewish Australians, and I think Australians generally don't like, and the polls show this domination of our streets by what they perceive as extremist groups. And this demonstration was a cry from the heart that represents most Australians, in my view, that, the ministers just don't get it. I mean, a synagogue has been burnt to the ground. I said I was coming from burnt Melbourne, and this was the winter of anti-Semitism in Australia that got a very strong reaction. It's just not good enough to talk about other discriminations which shouldn't exist, and if there's some graffiti on a bridge in Sydney, I'm against it too. But it doesn't compare with burning down a synagogue or blockading 300 people. It was in Sydney, this rally, in the Great Synagogue, which is in famous George Street in Sydney just last week. I think the Premier of New South Wales ought to be imitated by the Premier of Victoria, and there should be a ban on all blockades or political protests outside any religious institution, whether it's a Hindu shrine, a Jewish synagogue or a Catholic church.
So you've got Jewish Labor MP Josh Burns, who's pushing against the grain, it appears. I mean, you've got Tony Burke, Ed Husick, Penny Wong out there, pretty anti-Israel. Josh Burns is trying to push for tougher hate speech laws to address anti-Semitism. He wants to lower the threshold for vilification and put in place exclusion zones outside places of worship so people can't protest there. Two questions, Michael Danby. Do you think his proposal will get off the ground? But second, how do you feel about, more stringent anti-vilification laws? My concern with this is that it starts off trying to crack down on anti-Semitism, and then it gets used to stop all sorts of other speech, criticism of Islam, for instance, or other topics that become no-go zones because you run the risk of vilification.
Well, condemned for their total inactivity and hopelessness, and this has been called out by Julie and Lisa, is the Australian Human Rights Commission. They haven't stepped up, they haven't been heard of, they haven't done anything. The bloke appointed by Dreyfus to head it up is hopeless. He said that he met with Jewish groups just to show that he'd met with them rather than actually taking any action. I'm not sure that we need extra laws as you do. We need to tweak the existing laws that we've got. If, for instance, incitement laws were about what people said or they intended, like gas the Jews was a threat, you wouldn't actually have to have actual gassing of the Jews or death to the Jews. But the intention is something that the police could take on. And these kinds of intentions and incitement should be criminal offences. Now, Mark Dreyfus, you can just change that easily from being a civil offence to a criminal offence. If those terrible people who yelled and defamed Australia on the steps of the Opera House by yelling out "gas the Jews," and I don't believe for a second the false explanation proffered by the New South Wales Police that it was "wear the Jews," if those people had been facing criminal charges and their intentions were able to be judged in court, then we'd be in a lot stronger position. So it's very easy to change this. Don't need a big investigation. I'm pleased there is some investigation being made into it, and I agree that there shouldn't be demos outside any religious site, not just Jewish synagogues, but any religious site, including mosques. So there are solutions to this without restricting people's freedom of speech, James.
Yeah, absolutely. Michael Danby, appreciate your time tonight. Thanks for joining me.